All right, we're live. How's it going, everyone? Thanks for tuning in to our Giving Tuesday Marine Mammal Rescue recap of 2020, of our whole 2020 season. So my name is Brian. I'm the Community Outreach Manager for Marine Mammal Rescue, and I'm joined with Ashley, our Marine Mammal Rescue Manager over at the Seacoast Science Center. And we have a really cool Giving Tuesday special for you all. First off, I want to just say thank you so much to everyone who donated and participated in our Giving Tuesday fundraiser. We've already raised over $935. We're super close to the $1,000 goal that we have. And every cent of that goes directly to supporting our marine mammal rescue team and the work that we do to respond to animals in need on New Hampshire seacoast and northern Massachusetts beaches. So all the way down south to Crane Beach, Ipswich, that whole area. So it's gonna be fun. So thanks again to everyone out there who donated. Every cent goes a long way to helping our mission. And so let's kick it off here, Ashley. Let's just jump right into a couple of the most interesting and memorable marine mammal rescue cases that we've had this year. For those of you who are just tuning in now or aren't familiar with our marine mammal rescue program, we respond to seals, mostly seals, whales, dolphins, and porpoises that come ashore on our coastal beaches around here. And so we're the first responders out there, and we rely on the community to call into our hotline, and we're right out there. So Ashley, we have some really interesting stuff. Is there anything you wanted to say before we get rolling?
Sure. So again, thank you all for joining us this evening. For those of you that joined a little bit late, we will post this after, so you can go back and watch whatever you missed. But it's important to note that at the Seacoast Science Center, Marine Mammal Rescue, our program is only one of the many different programs that we offer at the center. Of course, education is a huge goal of ours, as well as conservation. So that fits in really nicely with our Marine Mammal Rescue program. But it is important to note that it's just one little arm of what we do at the center. So whether, the campers are coming, or hopefully sometime in the near future, the school kids will start coming back for in-person field trips instead of virtual. We do a lot over there, but this is the first program that we took on that basically the consumer is not paying for their service. We wish that these little seals and dolphins and whales and porpoise could carry their debit cards with them, but unfortunately they don't have that. They don't have those to offer us. So we do rely on the public, and we do look for grants as well. But we need to raise, just for this program alone, about $80,000 a year in order to make this program happen. COVID, of course, has had a huge impact, not only for us, but all of the nonprofits and businesses out there. So we're doing what we can. We had to halt all of our in-person fundraisers. We had to kind of switch over, become innovative a little bit, and go out into the virtual land, which was a little bit new for us. But just like this program here this evening, we're trying to adapt best we can to fill the gaps in that fundraising need. Luckily, we did get a federal grant this year for the program, but as far as raising the money through donations, we've only raised about $30,000 of it this year. So this program tonight will help a little bit with that. No donation is too small. I always try to stress that. We have little kids sometimes that will do lemonade stands, and they'll, mail us $5.13. Believe it or not, it all goes a long way. So never feel that your donation is too small. It's so greatly appreciated, especially right now as we try to work our way and navigate our way through this pandemic. Typically in an average year, we respond to about 110 cases a year, unique marine mammal cases. Of course, a lot of those are seals, but the pandemic did have an impact on that this year as well. Throughout the late spring through the beginning of summer, most of our beaches in our response territory were completely closed. So we literally the public could not step foot on those beaches. So there could have been animals out there, but thankfully, hopefully they were all doing pretty well, and they were able to get the rest that they need instead of having the humans and dogs be out there approaching them and not letting them get the rest that they need. So it's kind of a give and take a little bit. The pandemic has been really rough on us, but it may have been a little bit better for the animals that were out there. So right now, as of this morning, we did have a case this morning, but we're sitting at 86 cases for the year right now as we start to go into ice seal season, which we can certainly talk a little bit about.
Yeah, and so tonight we're going to go through 6 of the most interesting of those cases that really encapsulate the Marine Mammal Rescue Program. So let's dive right in, Ashley. The first one that we're going to bring up here is the case of Boone, the gray seal pup who lost his way. So Boone, personally, I wanted to name him Boomerang because he kept on coming back to us. I believe there was 4 cases total where we responded to Boone. Correct, Ashley?
That is correct. So this animal was a gray seal. He came to us back in February. So when we were experiencing some pretty cold weather. And just to give you a little bit of background on gray seals, they are a seal that we have here year round. They're our second least common of the 2 year-round seals, with harbor seals being our most commonly seen seal species. But gray seals typically will give birth to their young anywhere from December to early February, and then they're with mom for a period of 3 to 4 weeks before they're completely independent. So Boone was definitely a young gray seal, and therefore naive gray seal.
I'll pull in some video here right now, showing some of what Boone looked like, some of the responses. So this was Boone the first time that we saw him, and this was in Hampton Beach. We had a few of our responders keeping watch over Boone. Eventually, the second call that we had, we ended up bringing him into the center and placing a tag on him. So this is myself getting ready to, we uncrated Boone, and you can see that gray seals, even as pups, they're super aggressive. So what I do kind of a poor job here of getting on top of them, and usually you want them on the other side flipped around, but we put the tag on him, released him again. These are some more just shots of Boone. I think this was the 3rd time that we saw him. There was so many cases. But eventually Boone made his way onto Route 1A, which is what he became famous for. And Ashley and I met with ride police down there who were blocking off a part of the road just to make sure that people were going to swerve around this animal in the middle of the road. And that eventually we decided that his condition was deteriorating enough where we wanted to bring him to rehab. And Boone was successfully rehabilitated at National Marine Life Center. But I think the most interesting piece of this case is that he kept on coming back, but we as marine mammal rescuers decided that he was looking healthy enough that he didn't need rehab. I don't know if you want to speak a little bit more to that, Ashley, but just that decision making, like why did we let him go back out when and he just kept coming back?
Yeah, so this case happened between February 5th and February 8th. So again, over the course of 4 days. And he just kept showing back up. And normally that would not be a problem out on the sandy beach or even the rocky shore. But when you start getting up onto Route 1A, which he did not once, but twice here in Rye, it becomes an issue. So luckily, we work very closely with all of our police departments. They actually got the call before us. They got out to that animal. They stopped traffic, as Brian mentioned, so that we could start to evaluate the animal a little bit. We try to evaluate them a little bit before we get hands-on with them so that we can get a gauge for how they're feeling before they're stressed. Stress response, even if an animal is feeling extremely poorly, they go into fight or flight. So they will try to fight back, even if they're feeling really poor. So we did collect him again out of the road, day 3 and day 4. Once we got to day 4, however, one of his eyes was looking a little worse. He had corneal edema, so he had some swelling in the cornea, probably from an infection, but at that time we weren't sure if it was an infection or something like a puncture wound to the eye. So we collected him again. We gave him a lot of fluids. We knew it was him from the tag that we had placed on his hind flipper on day 2. But he had lost 2 pounds over those couple of days, which is a lot for a small seal. His eye was a lot worse. He was exhibiting a very clear pain response. He didn't want us anywhere near that eye. And it was squinted to the point of being almost completely closed. He also became a human interaction case. So on day 4, when he stranded in the middle of Route 1A again, we had really high tides those 2 days. So he was in the marsh, and then the tide was right up next to the road. He was more than likely just trying to get away from the incoming water, which found him in the road. But members of the public on the morning of day 4 found him before us or the police, and they actually picked him up and put him back in the marsh. where he remained right next to the road. So he was still drawing a lot of attention. So that's why we ended up picking him up. But we don't pick up every animal. We just can't do it. The rehabs can't hold that many animals. And also, we can't save every single animal. That's not our mission. But for those animals that are out there suffering, we try to lend a hand where we can. So for this animal, that eye was getting really bad. He was losing a lot of weight. He was really just a failure to thrive case and needed some time to figure things out.
Yeah, that's a really interesting statement, failure to thrive. And that's what we'll see with these very young, these younger pups. And so I actually also have some footage here from some of Boone's rehab, which we got from National Marine Life Center as well, and his release. So I'll play that for you. So this is Ashley. You're doing some hydration treatments here, I believe, right?
Yep. So this is one way we can do fluids subcutaneously. So basically just right under the skin.
Yeah, and this is Boone. I believe the last time he was looking kind of like a seal popsicle there, up on the marsh. But clearly happy that we were around to respond. So Boone was definitely a very cute animal. This is one of the last times that we crated Boone on the way down to rehab. This is Boone in rehab, doing well with the other inhabitants down there. He had a couple roommates. From what you could see, our partners in National Marine Life Center, they get busy in the winter pupping seasons for sure. And Boone, you could see he was definitely gaining weight in rehab. And by the time that we eventually released him, he was of weight and he was hopefully able to thrive after failing to in the beginning, right? So that I think that's a nice story for sure. And I just want to mention too, anyone out in the audience, if you have questions about any of these cases, feel free to leave them in the comments and we'll absolutely address anything that you have that you're wondering about. So yeah, that was really our first case we wanted to mention. Is there anything else about Boone you want to follow up with, Ashley?
No, I think he's a good example. He very quickly, he showed us how media can travel really quick, and especially social media these days. Once one person posts it, it tends to go viral pretty quick. But sometimes we get asked, by members of the public, especially if we're monitoring an animal on the beach, why don't you post where the animal is so that people know to stay away from it? But because these animals, they are cute, they are small, they look cuddly, though they're not. It's important to keep away from the animals. So actually the opposite tends to happen. If we post where an animal is when it's there, we have found that people are drawn out to that animal. Some of you may remember Snowplow, the humpback whale we had in 2016. We didn't post her upfront right away, but word traveled very quickly on social media that there was a large humpback whale deceased on shore. And we saw thousands and thousands of people, which on Route 1A, especially on some of those tight curves, can be really tough. So we do have a method behind our madness for why we don't post the animal when it is there on the beach, but we are happy to share it afterwards. We just want to draw more of a crowd to it than naturally occurs on the beach.
That's a really good point. That's a really good point. So that is Boone. That is Boone, the wayward gray seal, who kept on boomeranging back to us. So the next case that I want to bring up here, it's a different species. We're going to talk about harp seals, an unusual backyard visitor. So I started working for the team earlier in January, and so I kind of dove right into harp seals. And really, what was the craziest thing about them is the strange and unusual places that they end up. So I want to talk specifically about one harp seal that we responded to back by North Mill Pond in Portsmouth. So this is very far away from the ocean where this seal ended up, and it ended up in an unsuspecting family's backyard. So they were backed up right on North Mill Pond, and they came home from vacation and they found this seal. So I'm going to play a few of these, just a quick little video of of this harp seal in their backyard. It was really interesting. And so as you can see here, this animal was actually pretty healthy. It was very responsive to us. I believe it might have looked a little bit dehydrated in its eyes, but you can see there, anytime that anyone moved near it, it was responding to them. So the best thing that we ended up doing was using herder boards, which you can see here, to herd the animal away from the house and back towards that North Mill Pond. And one of the interesting things about this, so you can see right there, the animal ending up finally back in, after about a half hour of us, trying to herd it back towards the water, it makes its way in on its own, and was able to swim out back towards the entrance to the pond and towards the ocean. So the interesting thing with this case, though, was the timing of it. So the tide was going out, and the sun was setting too. This was later in the day, so we had to decide if we waited too long, the seal would have been stuck in North Mill Pond until the next high tide, which we thought there was too many people around, or it just wasn't an ideal scenario to have that animal stuck so far from a body of water. That we wanted to act and get the best course of action was to get the animal back into the water. So Ashley, I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about harp seals in general. Just they do find themselves in these weird places. Why is that?
So harp seals are one of my favorite species. So it's one of two species that we generally see that come down here and migrate down in the winter months. So basically for them, the colder weather we have, the snowier weather we have, the better it is for them. So they'll migrate down from the Arctic and the Canadian provinces. And these are unique animals. You'll see the other ice seal species in just a little bit, so I won't spoil that. But for harp seals, they're unique in that they have adapted so that in between meals, so they're used to being on pack ice and sometimes not being able to access water for long periods of time. Whereas our seal species here, the harbor and gray seals, get their fresh water from the food that they eat. So harp seals and hooded seals, because they are on pack ice for long periods of time, they have adapted to actually eat the snow and ice to stay hydrated between meals. But that can be a problem down here. They may come down one weekend, make that long journey, and then typical New England, our snow and ice may all melt. And then they're left with nothing but sand and rocks on the beach. And the problem with that is twofold. They'll sometimes, they're not as familiar with our seal species here with sand and rocks, and they'll sometimes ingest that thinking that it is snow and ice, which of course can lead to big problems in the GI tract, and can lead to death in some of these animals if they are eating large enough amounts of sand and big enough rocks. But also when they get stressed, especially if they're not feeling well, and then they get stressed on top of that. And when I say stressed, it can be as simple as somebody walking up to it on the beach when they're not supposed to be doing so. So when they do get stressed, they'll start eating and binging on the sand and the rocks, which again can become a big problem. But these animals, as that snow and ice does start to melt, they'll follow it. And if there's none there, they'll search for it. So they can become very wayward very quickly. We haven't had, I think we've had one or two, but we haven't had as many animals in the road. Our colleagues up in Maine have had animals that when plow trucks go out in the middle of a snowstorm and they're trying to plow the roads, they'll find a harp seal in the road. So we haven't had that yet. We've had them in parking lots and on quiet roads, but not during any big snowstorms. But you just never know where they're going to show up. We've had them way up in the marsh systems, 15 miles from open ocean. We actually had one in Groveland, Massachusetts. So those of you familiar with this area know that that's miles and miles and miles up the Merrimack River. So they do get pretty wayward, just as they're trying to navigate and find, that snow and ice source. But that's where we can step in and we can help them. So thankfully, this family knew exactly what to do when they came home from their long weekend away, and found a seal in their backyard. So it was great. Brian went out to that animal. The kids, they did just the right thing. They stayed way up on their deck, even though the seal was just below them. They all stayed nice and quiet. One of the children had a little harp seal stuffed animal, so they were watching everything that went on from a safe distance while we were able to get that animal back towards the water.
Yeah, I actually have a picture right here too I can share, just to show how close this animal got to their house. I'll pull this up. So yeah, sorry it's a little bit over us, but you can see right there in that bottom section, there's the seal right back up against the backyard, and the family was watching from their porch. And so it was really like seriously in their backyard. Like this, we needed to act and move this. But yeah, so such an interesting, that was a really cool case to start with for me, and be one of my first, Harp Seal cases. And as I eventually learned, before we move on to the next one, another cool fact about Harp Seals is that when we do if we do have to interfere and crate the animal to take care of them, they do play dead. It's really wild to see. It's like their, I guess, a survival tactic, or it's just a behavior that they do, but really, really interesting. Yeah, so we'll move on here. While we're talking about ice seals, we're gonna move on to another very special case that we had, and this was Nubble, the rare hooded seal that came onto Hampton Beach, like right in downtown Hampton. It was a very interesting case. This was right as the sun was going down. We got a call at this animal and came ashore, and as Ashley can attest to, we've only had how many cases of hooded seals before?
We've only had, so keep in mind, we respond to an average of 110 cases a year. We're up over 1,000 cases now since our program started in 2014. But we have only had 4 hooded seals reported in our area. They've all thankfully been alive. But that just goes to show you how infrequently we respond to this case.
Yeah, and I'll pull up some video right now. So this is video from our response to Nubble, the hooded seal. You can see this is when we got there. It was resting on its back. I believe this is a common behavior for these ice seals. And one of the things that I noticed when I got down there was it wasn't very responsive to people. As you can kind of see in this video, I took this with my iPhone, so I wasn't very far away. Us rescuers, we can get within 150 feet of these animals to assess them, and you can see it was, even though it looks very comfortable in that picture, it was keeping its eyes closed. It was taking these deep breaths. Ashley can speak a little bit more to that, but the animal, it looked like it was in some kind of a rough shape. It wasn't as reactive as we'd hope to really see these young animals on the beach. And something interesting to note too is that the nickname that the hooded seal pups get is called a blueback, and you can see that in that coloration of the animal. It's got a very, very distinct, light colored stomach and kind of gray, dark blue colored back. So that was pretty cool. But Ashley, if you want to speak a little bit more about why we decided to take Nubble in.
Sure. So Brian mentioned that they're often called bluebacks. So for the harp seals, both of these species, generally we see juvenile animals, but every once in a while we will get an adult, but they look very different for both hooded and harp seals. But juvenile harp seals have been given the nickname beater or beater coats, because for them, their spots as they molt and get bigger will almost essentially migrate towards their back. And when they're adults, they have a black head and then a harp-like pattern on their back, which is why they're called harp seals. But for hooded seals, the juveniles are called bluebacks, mainly because of that gray, almost blue looking in the right light back on them, and then a creamy white belly. So they're hard to mistake from our other seal species. Gray seals and harbor seals tend to look a lot alike, but their sizing and their head shape is a lot different. But for our ice seals, they both look different from each other, and hooded seals look very different in that they do have that blueback pattern. The adult male hooded seals will have the large inflatable sac on their head. But the bluebacks, they almost look alien-like. So if they look at you straight on, their eyes are really big and they're spaced really far apart.
Yeah.
So that's another telltale sign of that you're looking at a blueback or a hooded seal.
I have a good video here that really shows that, and this is from the release, the rehab and release of Nubble. So let me play that real quick. You can really see in this picture what Ashley's speaking of. That just the shape of their face, how far apart their eyes are on their face. Just they do have this very distinct look to them that none of the other seal species that we respond to have. And yeah, so this is actually Nubble being released back out to sea by National Marine Life Center after going through rehab, and that's Nubble on his way right back out to the big blue. And that is a really, really good point. Just how different they look. And I definitely implore you, if you've never seen an adult hooded seal. Google it, or look on YouTube. How the males inflate this membrane out of their nose to attract females. It's unreal. It's just really cool. So definitely check that out if you've never seen it before.
We haven't had an adult hooded seal, and hopefully we won't. They're like gray seals in that they get really, really large, especially the males. So gray seals, like hooded seals, can tip the scales at about 750 pounds. Whereas the smaller of the species are harbor seals, which are our most common, and also the harp seals tend to top out at about 5 to 6 feet and about 250 pounds. So they're significantly smaller. But in the case of Nubble, he was another animal that was responded to. So when we say the term ice seal, we mean harp and hooded seals. And we typically, though I don't say always, we typically only see them in the winter months because they are migrating down in the winter from the Arctic. So this animal was responded to February 11th. Again, Brian mentioned on Hampton Beach. Though that animal weight-wise looked good for a juvenile animal, he was exhibiting really stressful breathing, even when nobody was around him and he was very quiet and peacefully resting. He was contracting his chest a lot, heavy, wet, labored breathing, which is a concern, usually indicative of a pretty severe infection internally. So we did make the decision because it was really nice out and people were frequenting the beach. Hampton Beach can get really, really busy. We decided to pick that animal up that same evening, and we held and triaged that animal overnight and then transported him down to our partners at National Marine Life Center for rehab the following morning. We were able to give him fluids, start getting him hydrated again. He was pretty dehydrated. He had a pretty high temperature of 101, just over 101, which, again, for these ice seals, they're used to really cold temperatures, lots of snow and ice. We didn't have any snow at the time on the beaches, and it was pretty mild at that time. So for that animal, luckily, we were able to pick him up. He had also ingested quite a bit of sand as well. And when we ran his blood work, so we have a handheld, it's called an iStat analyzer. And it's similar to what veterinarians use, but very portable. So we can take it out in the field, run blood work right there, and get a real-time picture internally for how that animal is feeling and what the blood parameters look like. So that animal did show moderate to severe dehydration, but also very concerning. His oxygen saturation was only at 26%. So of course, perfect would be 100% or near 100%. So his oxygen sat was very low. So that was concerning as well. He did look quite a bit better the next morning and was being pretty vocal once we got him into the crate and into the truck and heading back down to National Marine Life Center. Their vocals are unlike any other seal I've ever heard. They kind of sound a little bit like Chewbacca. So if you haven't ever heard a hooded seal before, definitely look that up. It's a very interesting vocalization. So he's certainly feeling a little bit better, but he still had the temperature, still had the heavy, wet breaths. So we did bring him in for rehab, and he was found to also have a pretty heavy load of parasites as well.
Yeah, so thankfully we were there. And and as you saw, we were able to he was able to be successfully rehabilitated and re-released back out into the ocean. So that's definitely a success story for us, and it's such a rare success story too, because it's a rare animal for us up here. But the next case that I want to talk about is really more cases for us, and we get a lot of questions about these every year, especially during the summer during harbor seal season. But the next case I want to talk about is headless seals washing ashore. So one thing I will say before I place any of these videos is that some of the videos I'm about to play are a little bit graphic. It's nothing crazy, but they do depict the real other half of our responses, which are to deceased animals. It's about 50-50 for us. 50% animals that are alive, 50% animals that are deceased. And the deceased animals do allow us to paint to understand the populations here a bit more. And it's important for us to collect information about how many animals, what the mortality rate is looking like, how many, when we perform necropsies on them to figure out a cause of death. But the headless seals are really, it's an interesting thing that we always get asked questions about. Why are there so many seals that are washing up on our beaches without their heads or some limbs? And so I'm going to play for you a video right here that shows a few of these cases for you. So this one, as you can see, it's not completely headless, but you can see this seal. This was by Wallace Sands Beach over the summer. It's a harbor seal. And you can see that its head is really in an advanced state of decomposition as compared to the rest of its body. And some of its skin is sloughing off. This is another case. This one was down by Sawyer's Beach, in New Hampshire. This animal, you can clearly see that its head is missing from its body and that it has this sunburn on it. So actually, both of these are really interesting phenomenon that happen when a seal passes away at sea, deceased. And by the time that we end up responding to them on the beach, it could be a various amount. It could be freshly dead, this animal, or sometimes we respond to animals that are in very advanced stages of decomposition. So where would a headless seal fall on that range, Ashley? From freshly dead, or been deceased for weeks at this point? Where is it on that spectrum?
So it can vary a lot, but basically any animal that is alive that we respond to gets coded as a code 1. A code 2 would be a freshly deceased animal that more than likely, as long as we had the time, sometimes we're battling against the tides coming in on us, especially if they're a bigger animal. But code 2s, we try to get into the lab to necropsy or do a full postmortem exam on to learn more about these sentinels of the sea. So because there's so much that we don't know about them. So we try to learn whenever we can and do research whenever we can. But then you start getting into the code 3 animals. Code 5, I'll let you envision that, but it's more of a flattened animal that has been dead for weeks, sometimes even months, and the skin is basically like jerky. There's not much left of the animal. The inner organs are gone, but a lot of our headless animals or heavily decomped animals are typically code 3s or code 4s. And sometimes, inevitably we'll get the call on the hotline of, somebody beheaded the seal, it's on Hampton Beach at such and such location. And we never say never. There can be foul play. Sometimes that does happen. Thankfully, it's very few and far between in our response territory. But more often than not, what we're seeing is natural decomp. So, things like coyotes or seagulls, sometimes even turkey vultures, they find these animals pretty darn quick. And they typically will go after the inside of the mouth, the eyes, the ears, any soft spot that they can easily get into to start scavenging on the animal. And typically what happens when you start pulling back that skin and blubber layer, especially as these animals wash in and out with the tides, with a lot of our shore being rocky shore, as they get washed in and out, it further advances that decomp, even if it's not as natural of a decomp. And basically, once the skin is torn away from that animal and the spinal cord is exposed, it only takes a couple of knocks off of even a sandy beach, but more likely a rocky shore, to sever that spinal cord. And then the head is no longer there. Similar to the flippers, especially if they're sticking out. Those can go pretty quickly as well. So it's not uncommon to find a headless animal or partially headless animal, but that's the reasoning behind it. Oftentimes people will instinctively just think foul play, but more likely than not, it's just natural decomposition.
Yeah, definitely. That's a really good explanation. And I know I personally, when I started this job, that was one of the questions that I had when I started responding to deceased animals was I think I called you up and asked you what's going on with all of these seals. So yeah, the headless seals are interesting. And I'm going to touch on the next case that I want to talk about here is another case of deceased animals. But this is an unusual case for us. This only happens about once to twice a year max. And it is a predation on an adult gray seal. So this, we responded to over the summer, a case of a sub-adult gray seal. So this thing was around 300, 400 pounds, very large animal that washed up at Four Tree Island in Portsmouth. And I'm going to show you some of the pictures here because this one, we were eventually able to confirm that it was a shark predation. I believe we were able to confirm white shark predation too, Ashley, correct? So confirmed white shark predation. I'm going to show you some of the pictures here. Let me grab that for you. But Yeah, very, very rare. This only happens, I believe we've only had 9 total confirmed shark predations since 2014 when the program started. And so it's not something that we really respond to as much as our partners down on the Cape, but we do see it every now and then. And we're going to talk a little bit more. So you can see here 2 of our responders at the scene. You can see that gray seal on the bottom with that large wound on its side. This is a close-up of the wound, and it's important for us to take as many photos as we can when we respond to an animal like this, because it helps us to identify what happened to this animal. We were able to actually send all of these photos, and you can see those puncture wounds in addition to that one larger wound on the side of its body. So just overall, the shape you can see there, just for perspective, the size of the teeth that these subadults, gray seals have. But we were able to take all of those photos and send those to the shark experts that we work with. And they were able to confirm, based off the shape, the size, the depth of that wound, that it was white shark. And before, I want Ashley to explain a little bit more about that in a second, but just to kind of set the scene for this response, as you were able to see in some of those photos, this animal was right at the tide marker when we got there. So this is a 300, 400-pound animal. There were 3 of us there responding to it. At the time, the tide was coming in, and so we knew that we had to act fast. Ideally, we would be able to take that animal, because it was freshly dead, to our partners at UNH, who would perform a necropsy to confirm exactly what the cause of death was. Really go through it a little bit more, but we had to act very fast. And the best course of action for us was to take as many photos as we could, get the measurements, collect all of the data on site, and have that animal eventually wash back out as it was going to when the tide came in. So just like in terms of decision making, that's where why we didn't do anything further with that body. We didn't take it to necropsy. We really just had to, the conditions meant that we had to act fast. And it was too big of an animal for even the 3 of us, really, without, proper, we didn't have a tarp, we didn't have anything to really move it. It would have been a difficult, situation for us. So just that, there's the decision making. But Ashley, if you want to talk a little bit more about just this, I'll pull up the video again, but just the shape of this wound and why it was deemed a shark bite instead of anything else. So I'll pull that up for you here again.
Yeah. So this case was frustrating. We had 2 large male, we call them bulls, gray seals this summer, one in Portsmouth and the other at North Beach in Hampton, that were they were white shark predation events. So they had been bitten by a white shark. And, these are the perfect cases that we would have, on a normal day, loved to have gotten into the lab, because we don't see subadult and adult gray seals on shore very often. They typically will stay offshore. They have haul outs, not near people that they use. They just don't use our sandy and easily accessed rocky shore beaches. So both of these animals would have been ideal candidates to get into the lab. The problem is they're hundreds of pounds. So it takes there's a lot of moving parts to get that animal off the beach, get it into the truck, get it on ice, get it to the lab. And in both of these cases, the one in Portsmouth being that the tide was literally on top of you guys as you were trying to get all of the data points and get all of the photos. And unlike most of our animals, you can't just use 2 people and pick it up and move it up a little bit higher while you continue to take the data. But with the animal in Hampton, it was dark when we got out there onto the beach. So it would have been really, really late to try and get that animal off the beach. And things aren't as safe in the dark either. So in these events, it was very frustrating to not be able to get these animals off the beach. We hoped they would still be there the following morning. And of course, Mother Nature was not on our side, and the tide reclaimed those animals.
Yeah.
One in Hampton showed up a number of days later. But of course, an animal with that much blubber that's been baking in the sun for a few days, wherever it may have been, is not an ideal necropsy candidate anymore. And they are pretty expensive. So we have to kind of pick and choose what animals we can work up. But when we look at the suspect shark predation at that point, because it wasn't confirmed yet, that's where our partners and this network of responders and agencies really comes into play. We just don't have the training to determine for sure. We may think it was a shark predation, or we may think it was a coyote predation or propeller wounds from a boat. But in the case of sharks, it's really hard unless you find a tooth in the animal to say for sure. But they have these shark experts that's what they do day in and day out. So we were able to take measurements of the bite radius and photos of the bite radius and send it to our colleagues and explain the case. And they came back and said, not only is it shark predation, it's definitely white shark.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, from what I gather with white sharks, is they'll leave kind of a jagged edge, almost like a triangular pattern in the linear edges of the wounds. But again, when we reached out to them, they were like, sometimes with these deep bites, really look around to see if you're able to find teeth, because oftentimes they'll break a tooth when they hit the bone. We weren't able to find any teeth in those wounds, but we were thankful that we were able to catalog it as confirmed shark predation.
Oh, trust me. I was looking for a tooth in that when I was down there, because that was the first thing that I thought, just the size of that wound and the shape and the punctures that were additional in there. I was beside myself looking for a tooth, because that would have been like the coolest thing. Well, it would have been very cool, but it would have really helped in terms of confirming. But I want to pull up a video here too of what a propeller injury looks like on a seal. Again, these are slightly graphic images for those watching, but just to show the difference between what a shark predation looks like and a propeller wound. So here are some propeller wounds that this is from the past that you've responded to, Ashley, correct?
Yeah, so that animal was down in Seabrook Harbor, for those familiar with the area. I believe this is that same animal. So generally, propeller wounds will be very linear, often parallel to each other, and very clean. Not clean in the sense of dirty or clean, but clean in the sense that you can see in this picture here. It's basically a slice through the animal's skin, blubber, and fur. So this was a different animal. That's another, we still say suspect propeller wound, but it's pretty clear in that photo.
Yeah.
But it's not always that clear. Luckily, in the case of these two gray seals, they were really freshly dead. So, the wound margins hadn't been sitting in the sun or getting really dried out or getting eaten by gulls or any other number of scavengers out there. They literally had recently happened. So we were looking at a pretty clean injury to be able to tell what happened. But if the animal's been sitting out there for a while or has washed in and out multiple tide cycles, it's not always clear. Sometimes a shark predation can look like a boat strike or vice versa, or can be something different altogether, whether it's a canine predation, something along those lines, or just scavenging after the fact, after the animal died. So it's sometimes like a little game of detective, but it's really interesting to see what we can learn and find from these animals. So, sometimes the public naturally will get the calls on the hotline for the live animals, especially the ones that clearly need help. But for the deceased animals, the public doesn't always recognize that they're equally as important to us to be able to collect this data and do some post-mortem exams.
Yeah.
To look at what might have happened.
Yeah, that's very true. And so, that just kind of rounds out. So if you do see a seal, this is just important mentioning, whether it's dead or alive, always give us a ring, because it's crucial that we collect this data and record, all of these cases. So we're going to move now to our last case, which is a bit more uplifting than some of these deceased, white shark predations and headless seals. We're going to move on to Derby, the boy who lived. So I make that Harry Potter reference because Derby does have a big scar on its ear, and I'll show you some videos of this case. But Derby it's an incredible case of this young harbor seal pup that just defied the odds, and it had these very gruesome injuries on its head, and it was able to survive. So I'm going to play some of this for you here. I have a before and after of Derby, and Derby, Ashley will explain a little bit more about just the response case, but we responded to Derby. We helped out down in Marblehead. So this was a bit down south for us, but you can see here, we've collected Derby, and you can see those wounds that he has right on its head. And this is afterwards when Derby was released back out to sea by National Marine Life Center after 2 months of rehab. You can see he still has a scar on the left side of its face, but this animal, just look at how much bigger it is. That's an absolute transformation that a couple months can do. And Derby was resilient, able to overcome his injuries, and be released back out to sea successfully. So this is a case where we looked at this animal initially, and it definitely looked in rough shape, and it was one of those where we had to decide if it would be able to survive on its way down to rehab, from what I remember. But Ashley, if you want to talk a little bit more about just the case of Derby and like how we got to him, what was wrong with his head, that one was a wild one.
Yeah, that was an interesting one for sure. So you guys can imagine, in any live animal rescue organization, whether it be marine mammals or domestic animals, farm animals, what have you, sometimes responders are faced with the very difficult decision of humane euthanasia. So sometimes, these animals, despite your best efforts, just aren't going to survive. In some cases, animal welfare comes into play, and you need to determine, if this animal is unlikely to survive, why are we going to put it through the stress of transport and triage, for rehabilitation versus just humanely euthanizing it. So that came into play with this animal. So Brian mentioned that we picked it up in Marblehead, Massachusetts. So some of you that were on at the beginning might say, wait a minute, but that's south of Essex, where our territory stops. But that's where the network comes into play. So when New England Aquarium gave up that territory in Massachusetts, it became a gap in coverage, which is typically what we refer to it as, meaning that there's no small organization like ourselves that are responsible for that territory. So it falls on NOAA Fisheries. They do thankfully have an office in Gloucester, so they're pretty nearby. But they're ultimately the federal organization that oversees all of us smaller organizations that have different pieces of the territories from Maine through Virginia, which is known as the Greater Atlantic Regional Stranding Network. So Marblehead is not formally our territory, but NOAA Fisheries, they don't have a volunteer base like we have, thankfully, and they don't really have the staff to be going out into the field while they're trying to manage all of these other organizations that do this work. So we have told them, because they are nearby to us and we have the volunteers that are willing to drive around, we have told them that if there are animals that need response in that area, to reach out to us. So they did just that. This call for this animal first came in on June 28th, but it was on an island in Salem, Massachusetts. We got photos from the reporting party. We knew that the wounds were severe, but before any response could even be considered to be mounted to find boats and such, the animal went back in the water. So that does happen as well. But thankfully, that animal showed back up 2 days later. I call him my birthday seal because we picked him up on my birthday in Marblehead. So that was how I spent my birthday this year. So we went out there. He showed up on a pretty populated beach, thankfully right by a couple of different restaurants and a beautiful little pavilion. So actually the owners and staff at the restaurant were hugely helpful before we got out there. It's not an area that's really close to us, so it takes us a little bit of time to get down there, but they were able to, with the help of the ACO, the animal control officer, they were able to keep the public away. Luckily, it was a little bit rainy that day, so it wasn't really busy on the beach. But we were able to get out there, pick that animal up, and start the evaluation. So we started looking at the animal. Those severe wounds to the head were really infected. So a telltale sign of heavy infection is the smell, which isn't always great to experience, but it's pretty indicative of a heavy infection load. But also with this animal, that one of the biggest parts of the wound impacted the ear. And because the infection and swelling was so bad, we couldn't tell how bad it was for the ear canal, but we couldn't even really identify the ear when we were looking it over, as right here it came out of the crate. So you can see it's pretty much that whole left side of the face. But then when we rolled that animal over, he also had multiple infected wounds all over his abdomen and flippers. So initially, we suspected seal pox virus, which is very similar to chicken pox virus in humans. And it is very contagious to other seals. So, if you think about that on top of the infection, we were faced with this decision of, if it is pox, we're exposing all of these other pups because it was harbor seal pupping season in rehabilitation to this pox virus when we don't even know that this animal is going to make it because the infection is so bad. So the next step from there was to take blood and look at his blood values and see, what did we think his chances of survival were, not factoring in if he was contagious or not. So we were looking at that. We were talking with our vet. We were talking with National Marine Life Center to figure out, do we drive this animal down? It's clearly in a lot of pain, or do we humanely euthanize it? But we decided to give it a shot. National Marine Life Center had an area where they were able to isolate that animal until they knew whether he was contagious, which is hugely important. He was also really, really small given the time of year. So he was obviously suffering for quite a while. You can see he's really thin. So generally, harbor seal pups are about 23 to 25 pounds at birth, which is usually around May. So this was the very end of June, pretty much into July, and he only weighed 16 and a half pounds. So he was just very small overall. So you have to take that into consideration as well. These are essentially babies. So if you picture a human baby, they're really no different. They're very fragile animals. They don't overcome infection very well. Gray seals are a lot stronger than harbor seals. So here you can see them, we always step back afterwards and we're like, oh my gosh, we considered euthanizing this animal. But sometimes it shows you, these animals have a fight and a will to live. Certainly not all of them, but this was the perfect case of that we weren't sure. We were teetering between rehabilitation and humane euthanasia. But this animal defied all odds and overcame those huge infections. It took him a long time to learn how to eat. He was in there a little bit longer than your typical seal, about 3.5 months. But they suspect that those wounds on the head were bite wounds. So more than likely coyote would be my thought right off the bat. But then he had all of those little, what normally would be superficial wounds, but because he had such an infection throughout his body, they all became infected. So that was a tough case, but so rewarding at the end when you see what they turn into. I think he was about 60 pounds when he was released. So they have to be at least 50 pounds when they get released from rehab, eating completely on their own, and off of all medications and antibiotics for at least 2 weeks before release. So once he figured out how to eat, he went from 16 pounds to over 60 pounds in 3.5 months. So
yeah, he was hungry. Hungry to get back out in the ocean. Yeah. And that transformation was like the coolest thing to see, because he came, like you said, he came in at just this very small, thin, underweight animal. And that last photo that we saw, I'll pull that one back up one more time just because it's worth seeing this transformation. Just looking at like this small, injured animal, like those are definitely, yeah, you can see the infection right there.
His ear would be right in the middle of that big wound.
That's what's crazy. And he does. I call him the boy who lived because he does have that scar, even after rehabilitation. But this transfer, this is in rehab that you see this. He definitely got that. He had that fight and was able to really turn it around. And this last photo, I think, just says it all. Is he is ready. He's a healthy animal now, thanks to our decision to take him down to rehab. And I think this is the perfect case to kind of end this Giving Tuesday live special on. It's just a little sense of hope, is that even some of the animals that we get that are in really poor conditions, we're able to help turn around. And it's all thanks to our efforts, the community's efforts in helping us be aware of these animals, and then our partners like National Marine Life Center, who help us to rehabilitate them. It's really a team effort, and we wouldn't be able to do this without you all. So I really want to say again, We'll stay on for a few more minutes here. Just if anyone has any questions about any of these 6 cases that we talked about, feel free to shoot us a message in the comments. If you feel like you want to wait around and ask them later, shoot us a comment, and one of us, Ashley or I, will get back to them at a later time too. But I just really want to say again, thank you so much to everyone who's participated in our Giving Tuesday fundraiser. We're it's not over yet. I have no doubt that we're going to hit that goal of $1,000. But these 6 stories are really, they tell why the work we do is so important, why you all are so important to the work that we do. And I think it's, we hit on every seal species that we respond to, really. So it's been a wild year. 2020 hasn't been able to hold us back. So yeah, is there anything else that you wanted to close with, Ashley?
Yeah, that's a great point, that 2020 hasn't held us back. Of course, financially, it's been hard on the Science Center, as it has been for so many organizations out there. But that's why, we count on you guys to help us out wherever you can, not only financially, but also for being our eyes and ears out on these areas. So if you frequent the beach a lot, I encourage you to put our hotline number in there. Even if you happen to have our hotline number and, but you're not in our area, but you find an animal and don't know who to call, you can still reach out to us and we'll route you to the appropriate agency. Certainly Google is a good option as well, but not everybody, knows how to work that. So we're happy to be a helping hand for that as well. But it's been a tough year. Luckily, our numbers have been lower because, of course, we've had staff head cutbacks and things like that just to make the budget and make ends meet. But thankfully, the numbers have been a little bit lower. I mentioned we're sitting at about 86 cases right now. As we do start, ice seal season could start any day now. But we've been trying to fill the gaps, luckily, because the field has been a little bit quieter. We've been trying to fill the gaps on the back end with, applying for different grants and doing some of these informative webinars where we do, of course, seek donations as well. But just, doing what we can to make sure that we come out the other end of this and come out stronger. Definitely.
That's the key, to come out stronger. We're all going to come out stronger from this, for sure. And I think, yeah, like you said, that's one of the big things. That this is my first year. I'm fresh into this. I am right off the bat realize how important everyone out there is to us being able to successfully accomplish our mission. We couldn't do it without you all. So we're all in this together. We're going to keep being able to respond to these animals in need on the beach. And I think the big takeaway, next time that you see any of these 4 species, winter's coming up, you're going to start seeing the harp seals and hooded seals. Give us a ring. Be those, be the silent hero on the beach that gives us a ring, stays back, and just helps us accomplish our work. It really, we've met such incredible people out there in the field, and every time that we respond, it's a new situation, and I'm always just pleasantly surprised by how helpful people can be, just beforehand, just in calling us, when we're at the beach and helping us out, and just afterwards donating and helping to support our work and helping to share what they've learned with their friends and family. So just a big thank you to everyone who took the time to watch this tonight, who donated. Definitely share with your friends and family. This is a good little conversation. You've just learned a ton of information to bring with you to the holiday dinner table. This is, share it with your friends and family. Let them know what you learned about marine mammals on your coast.
And hopefully you never find whales, dolphins, or porpoises on the beach, but it does happen.
It does happen. Yeah.
They're not huge case numbers for us, but we typically, I think we had 3 porpoises this year. Knock on wood, we haven't had any dolphins or whales this year, which is the first year in a number of years that we haven't. But if you do come across those animals too, we're the ones that you give a shout to.
Awesome. Yeah. So we'll wrap it up here. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Have a happy and safe holidays, and we look forward to hearing from you in the future. And if you have any questions, never hesitate to reach out to either Ashley or myself at the Seacoast Science Center. Yeah.
And it looks right now like we're only $65 away from our goal of $1,000 on this Giving Tuesday. So
nice.
Hopefully with your help, we can get there.
Nice. Yeah, definitely share it around.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you all. Bye.